This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, an international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. To join our global community and access member-only webinars, events, a wide range of digital learning offerings, coaching and leadership resources, accreditation schemes, and more, you can find us at associationforcoaching.com. Hello, everyone. I'm your host for this podcast series, Coaching in the Climate Crisis, and my name is George Warren, and I'm joined today by Charlie Cox, who's the founder of the Climate Change Coaches and a working coach herself. I should also say that it was Charlie that helped me find my link between coaching and the climate crisis, so it gives me a great honor and a pleasure to welcome you to the show. Charlie, welcome.
Thanks, George. It's nice to be here.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good. Yeah, it's the end of a lovely sunny day in Oxford where I live.
Fantastic. So what would be great would be to start to hear a bit about your journey from coach to climate change coach.
So I'm relatively new to working on climate change. I probably have worked a lot on social justice and social change for most of my career. And even my coaching career, I was working with people who were social change agents or international development people. And then in 2016, I had our first daughter, and we now have two. And I sort of woke up to big structural problems in the world, is sort of the easiest way to say it. So I suddenly felt like I didn't exist because I was a woman with a buggy, not a woman with a briefcase. And I started to see gender and also race and income inequality. I started to almost see everything, which sounds weird for someone who'd worked around social change for such a long time. But I guess it came home in a way. It came home to me. And, make no mistake, I was living a relatively privileged existence, homeowner, husband who worked, not necessarily marginalized existence, but it really started to make me think. And I started looking at lots of structural things that were wrong in the world and how we'd got there, how the system had been allowed to create them. And everything seemed to keep coming back to climate change. And then somebody I was introduced to, who is a collaborator to this day, had just finished her MBA and was about to start a business and met someone who sent her an article that made her ring her co-founder and say, "I'm sorry, I can't build this business with you. I've got to do something about climate change." And she sent me the article, and it was the forerunner of what is now the uninhabitable Earth. And I was so shocked and arrested by what I read in that New York article that I felt like I was about to be homeless for the first time. And I sat on a beach in Dorset reading it. So it was a very odd feeling. And I spent 7 years of my life in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, which is obviously a country that created a lot of homeless people, internally and externally displaced. And so I spent a lot of time reflecting on that and feeling into their experience almost for the first time, having lived there for such a long time. So I heard Joanna Macy the other day talking about her entry point being grief. And I think my entry point was grief as well. I felt tremendous grief after the initial shock. And I couldn't look away. And just like my friend who had rung up her co-founder and said, "I can't look away," I couldn't look away either. And I also didn't know what to do about it. So I thought, well, okay, I'll have to stop being a coach then. And I'll have to start being a climate scientist, will I? I'll have to retrain. That seems like a really scary long journey that I don't understand. So I spent about 2 years interviewing people, just collaring people on LinkedIn and saying, "Please, can we have a conversation? Anybody from all across different bits of the system, just tell me what's going on." And everyone I said, "Tell me the problems you want solved." And most of the time they would give me problems that I couldn't in a million years solve. But every now and again, someone would give me a little piece of what became my jigsaw. And then one day somebody sat me down and drew a very complicated map of all the stuff going on. And he said, "It's not just climate change, it's all this other stuff as well." And it absolutely frightened the pants off me. And then he said something totally fundamentally shifting for my mindset. He put in the middle the word consumption. And he said, "That's the driver of all of this." And as soon as he said that, what he essentially said for me was, people are in the middle of this. People have created this problem. And I think here, sitting in 2021, we totally take that for granted. But a few years ago, I don't think people really saw this as a human problem. They saw it as a problem for the polar bears or a problem for the Amazon. They didn't see themselves in the picture. And I used to be a photographer, and when I looked at the pictures, I didn't see people in them. Literally, there were no people in them. And so I would start with talks that I was doing or workshops that I was running. I would ask people, what are the images of climate change? And they would say all these pictures with no people. And then I'd hold up a credit card and say, this is climate change. This is an image of climate change. It's our consumption. And that's brilliant news, because we can do something about that. So for me, that was a complete eureka moment, because suddenly it brought it back into my wheelhouse. It made it all about people. And so as someone who works with people, I thought, great, okay. So then I started attending to the psychology of it and listening underneath the words of the interviews that I was hearing on TV, on the radio, in the conversations I was having. And underneath everything, I kept hearing a recurrent powerlessness. And I thought, okay, so there's a job here to move people out of powerlessness and into a sense of agency. And the job is not just as simple as it is in coaching right now, which is, I don't believe I can. Yes, you can. Of course you can. It's more not just, I don't believe I can, but I don't believe the system can. I don't believe the world can pull this off. So now we need to do some thinking about what are the tools that help people believe in the planet and in humankind, as well as believing in themselves and their own ability. And along the way of that took me to rebranding as a climate change coach, which is a name I just made up on the spot. I thought that alliterates, and it sounds like what I intend. I intend to do something about climate change, and I'm a coach. Literally just changed the website and said, if you want to do something about climate change, you don't know what, come to me and I'll hold your hand and we'll work it out together. And then very quickly after that, I found myself creating the Climate Change Coaches, building a team, and going on a very different journey in building that company, which is a training company. So it's a long sort of stumbling journey, I would say, into climate change. But I want to make that point that it's a stumbling journey, because I know that there will be people listening to this who are either expecting me to have some really polished answer about how I always knew what I was doing, or are themselves feeling that they don't know what they're doing. And I want to put power in your arm, if you're listening to this, that it is an iterative process to work out your place, but every single one of us has a place on the pitch. You just need to work out whether you're a striker or a goalkeeper or a lines person, but you've got a place on this pitch, because all life is lived in the context of climate change now.
So, Charlie, it would be great to hear a bit about the work that the climate change coaches do.
So we want to make every conversation about climate change count. And we recognise that right now a lot of them aren't counting, by which I mean people are having conversations where they need to influence other people to act, but they're not able to get past that sense of powerlessness or resistance to change. And we know that coaching skills can do that for people. So we work with two different groups, essentially, but doing a very similar thing in both places. So we help organizations build an army of people who can support a change process. So organizations that have said, we're going to net zero, or we're making some really big climate pledge. The next step on is, how do you get your people on board with that and make that change happen? And that requires a lot of influencing skills, but also it might require some supporting skills for those staff who start to really realize what this is all about. And so we train internal coaches to be able to support people through that change, but we also train the change makers themselves in coaching skills. And then the other group that we work with is a completely other end of the scale, which is networks of often social entrepreneurs or systems changers. So an example of that might be the food systems charity Feedback, or it might be C40 Cities, who are decarbonising cities around the globe. And there, what we're doing is we're training their network members in those coaching skills, and they're using them at City Hall with a local mayor or in their community to affect a change there. So it's working at lots of different levels at once, at organizational level, at community level, and then ultimately at systems level as well. Just really giving people the skills to manage the emotional side of climate, to be able to connect to hearts a bit more and get change to happen in that way. And so often we're working with people who are technically exceptional and who say to us, there's something missing because change isn't happening enough. And there's a sort of feeling that they're not having the impact they want to have in their careers and their work. And we know that we can just, in very short order, train them in coaching skills that will transform the impact they have, and also build them really solid relationships for the long term, which in turn helps their resilience. It's a real pleasure to be able to help people who are on the front line, if you like, making those big leaps forward. And it's hugely inspiring every day. It's hugely inspiring to meet people. And the other nice thing we do, of course, as part of that, is we train internal coaches. And frequently, just like we've had this in this conversation, this idea of coaches saying, do I have a role here? We hear the same sentiment from internal coaches. And then they start talking about it internally, either in formal coaching sessions or just at the water cooler, so to speak. And they realize, wow, I have a huge role. One of the things we do that I really love is we help people feel significant. We help them feel that they count, that they can have a role, that they can make a difference. That's a real privilege to be able to do that.
And it was a privilege to be part of it as well as an attendee. And yeah, that word empowering again coming in of it's empowering coaches to then help empower their clients who can then affect a huge amount of change.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a ripple effect. Yeah. So if you listen to this podcast and you do nothing else, just believe. It's not fashionable to believe. It's fashionable to be cynical. But cynicism can really undo our ability to act and to enroll others to act. And so believe that, what is it Henry Ford said, whether you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're right. We'd like to believe we can.
What a wonderful sentiment. There's so much I can relate to there in your iterative, stumbling journey, and that sense of powerlessness that you spoke about, and also those emotions. For me, I've experienced a lot of grief about the future, but also some guilt and anxiety and a sense of imposter syndrome. Who am I to be speaking about this? And I think the fact that we can talk about these things is really important. I don't think there is a perfectly polished journey into talking or acting on climate change.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And what's interesting is in the people we speak to people who've been in and around this world as technical experts for decades, and they say they don't know enough, and they say they feel like imposters. So who is this mythical person that knows enough and feels secure? Because this is a rapidly changing, massively complex picture. And like I said, it's not just global heating, it's biodiversity loss, it's, there's so many other aspects. So no one person can know everything. And I think there is something that's happened here, which I saw happening in international development, which is that in order to be in this space a long time, you become quite disembodied. You almost have to live in a country like Sierra Leone for 7 years, surrounded by incredible poverty. To some extent, I had to push those feelings down and sort of cut myself off from those feelings and turn it into a very cognitive existence. And I think that's happened for a lot of people who've been in the climate space a really long time. And as a result, that's turned it into a very intellectual problem. In actual fact, what we know works is connecting people emotionally to the issue. And I had a meeting last week with a very famous advertising agency. And they said, we want to do something. We don't know if we're allowed. And we said, you're exactly the people. You've got to do something. You know how to win hearts and minds. And that's the most important thing. And we had this very interesting conversation about how we're selling something here in the same way that you would sell, the cup of tea I'm clutching in my hand. We're selling the idea that people should be able to do something about climate change that feels resonant and feels possible and positive, and that the system can change. We're selling belief, all of us. And so, it's the same techniques. We've just not applied them because we've put it in a different category, in a different bucket. Just as in coaching, we are selling support for people through change. It's just a change journey in a different way.
And that's that sense of, are we allowed to talk about this? I think permeates so much of this conversation. And I guess to our listeners, whether they're coaches or leaders that coach or people interested in coaching who might be asking that question, are we allowed to be talking about this?
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I want to be really compassionate for that feeling and for the values that underpin that. When I first started talking to people about wanting to do something about climate change, a lot of people that I respected told me I wasn't allowed to because it was taking an agenda. And yet I had a friend who's now one of my colleagues who was a sustainability coach because she came from a background in sustainability. So somehow it was okay for her to do it because she had a background in sustainability. But it wasn't okay for me to do it because I didn't. And I couldn't work that out because I wasn't going to be telling people what to do about climate change. So I didn't need that background in sustainability. I didn't need the technical. I was going to be coaching people to work out what they wanted to do about it. However, I think what coaches are really asking when they ask that question, am I allowed, is what they're really asking is, I want to tell people about this. I want to engage people. I want to wake them up. I want to make people care. These are all legitimate feelings. How can I do that and be a coach? And I do think there's an amount of being honest and owning that that's required. And so that might be as simple as, I did it the really simple way because I'm probably a bear of little brain. And so I just changed my website to say, I coach people on climate change. And that's a really easy public way that people now know my agenda's clear, it's out there. Before you come into a session, it's out there. But that doesn't mean that I'm expecting every client I ever work with to always talk about climate change or to, be sort of always doing something really positive. They're allowed to be human beings in sessions with me, but I'm honest about it. Or it might be contracting in a session. It might be saying, listen, you're doing a 10-year plan here. Should we factor in things like climate into your 10-year planning? What do you think the world's going to look like in a decade? It might be as simple as that. But I do think that honesty is really important because what we want to be doing is making sure we're not taking power away from the client or the person in the street, because it might not be in a coaching conversation. It might be using our skills. We want to make sure that everyone feels safe to have that conversation. And so in the climate change coaches, a lot of what we're doing is teaching people how to make sure that people feel safe. They don't feel hijacked. They feel like they've had the power to say, I don't want to have this conversation, and for that to be respected. And so I think we need to, as coaches, we need to ask ourselves, what is my intention here? Do I want to force people to care about climate change? And am I hoping, as one of my team said, she said, I don't want to be an activist in coaches' clothing. Is that really what I actually want deep down? Don't make yourself bad for that, because all of us want this to be addressed. So how attached are we to every conversation we have? And, and what we're doing in the climate change coaches is teaching people to value the relationship first and the issue second. And that's very difficult when you really care about the issue. But actually, if you attend to the health of the relationship, the issue can be brought in much more safely, much more successfully. So I think there's some ethics here. And there's some honesty required. Like I said, all life is lived in this context. So I think it's there in most people's minds. And you only ask the question and it's there. And the final thing on that I'd say is that we started the climate change coaches doing some pop-up street coaching for fun. So we went to London's first zero waste Christmas market. We took a bunch of us who are still the team today, and we coached people for free. And we just said, we grabbed people out of the crowd and we said, do you want some conversational coaching on climate change? And everybody said yes. And everybody had a really interesting conversation with our coaches. So I think it's also a bit of a myth that people don't want to talk about this. I think they feel massively judged, massively guilty and blamed, and they don't want to have that conversation. But if you can have a different conversation, which says your concerns are legitimate, and yeah, it is terrifying, and yeah, it is really complicated, and just really normalize and acknowledge where they're coming from, I think you end up in a really, really interesting conversation with people.
And all of my experience as well, I'd agree with that. And I heard the word judge there, and that sparked something for me, which is that judgment is such for me, a danger in climate crisis conversations, because you don't want the other person to feel judged. And as well, because the topic is so all-encompassing and it's so emotive and it's so close to all of us, it's an extra challenge for the coach to manage, recognize, and do something about their own sense of judgment as well.
Yes. And so we have a coach trainee program, and people come into that program. Largely, I think, I mean, you can tell me because you've done it, wanting the skills to work with other people. And then what they learn along the way is how much work they have to do on their own relationship with climate change in order to do that. That's because of the existential kind of systemic sort of quality of the problem. So an example would be if somebody comes to you and says, listen, I'm having a big fight with Bruce in purchasing. Your client is complaining about a colleague. Maybe you work with someone who is annoying like Bruce, and you might go, oh yeah, I can imagine Bruce. But you're pretty good at unattaching yourself, at self-managing, going, I don't know Bruce, I'm not my client, I can be distant from this topic. But when a client comes and says, listen, I'm really worried that my kids aren't going to want to have kids, and you have children, and you've also had that thought, you're a bit on the hook. So then you think, it's all right, though, because it's their topic. But then they start telling you how that topic feels, and you feel those things too. They articulate your own emotional experience. So then what we have to go to is another layer down, which is, but their relationship to those feelings is different to my relationship to those feelings. And the antecedents of those feelings in that person is totally different because we've lived different lives. And so there's a different way of self-managing, which is, it takes a lot more muscle, it takes a lot more consciousness when we're talking to people about climate change topics than when we're just talking to them about individual coaching, I would say. That's why it's really worth doing your own work. It's worth having your own coach. It could be a colleague that you do coach swap with for free. It doesn't have to be an onerous, expensive thing, but it is worth having some outlet for supervision as you're going through this kind of work. And it's hugely rewarding at the same time, because when you help someone believe in themselves in individual coaching, they grow confidence to do things they've never done before. But when you help them believe in the system, in humankind, you turn them into a systems changer. And that's so exciting, to help someone believe that they can affect communities, can affect systems, is just, the best feeling.
How do you do that?
Well, so, I mean, an easy answer is you scaffold their belief in the system. So if you think about the tools you'd use in one-to-one coaching, just translate them across. So what you'd say to somebody, well, tell me how you've done it in the past. So you might say, well, tell me where you see the system having done it in the past. And we see this, the climate movement's quite clever on this. So you often hear people talking about how, look what we did with CFCs. We did it with CFCs. We can do it with this. And that's because people recognize that people need help making that imaginative leap. And so they need to believe that the system can change. So a sign of it changing is useful. And I think it's worth being aware of, like, what are you trying to do? You're trying to help people believe in the concept of systems changing or humankind changing. So actually the examples don't have to be environmental. You could use the abolition of slavery. You could use the suffragette movement, getting votes for women in the UK. There are lots of different places you can look for signs of big shifts. And so that's why I think for me, COVID was really interesting. And it's obviously horrific, and it continues to be a global disaster in so many ways. And at the time, this time last year, people were saying, this is going to be the end of flying, and the end, people were really hopeful about the sort of the system having stopped, when actually what happened is it had just gone on pause. But I think what has happened is our imaginative capacity has changed. We're able now to see and believe in rapid overnight change for the sake of it. When we really have to, we really do it. I hope that that's what we take from COVID into the climate emergency, that we can say, but look, we did do these big shifts. It is possible. So what were the circumstances, what were the conditions that made that happen in COVID? At the political level, at the organizational level, what shifted? And clearly existential threat was a big one. But what about that? Can we start creating those decisions without necessarily the system already being in crisis. I mean, it is in crisis on one level. I don't want to say we're not there yet, because we clearly are there, but we don't have, nationwide flooding, for example, or, globalized events that are as dramatic as COVID yet.
Yet.
Yes. Yeah.
And if we look at the coaching industry, still relatively young and emergent, what change do you think the industry needs to go through around this crisis we're in?
That's a really hard question to answer. I think my answer probably tends towards paradigm shift. I think there is a yearning in the people we work with to be more connected in lots of different ways. More connected to themselves, more connected to their families, more connected to their communities. And what they probably don't yet say is more connected to nature. They may say that as a result of COVID. I don't know. And I think if we're not careful as coaches, all we will do is serve the individual. And if we're really not careful, all we'll do is serve the extrinsic motivators of those individuals. Help me get a better job, help me get a promotion, help me demonstrate to others that I'm valuable with outside, indicators of status. At its very worst, I think that's what I see coaching doing sometimes, and not questioning that in the client, not challenging that. At its best, I think coaching can connect us to what we truly care about, our values, our purpose, our deeply held beliefs. But I think the thing that coaching probably doesn't do as well as it could is really land that into the real world. So we've just started building all this amazing resonance. What are you going to do with it? And I was taught that coaching deepens the learning and forwards the action. And all of us as coaches have a default place. Some of us like forwarding the action, some of us like deepening the learning, and it's our job to kind of balance the two. I think what sometimes happens in coaching is that you have really good action people helping people action the extrinsic, and really good deepen the learning people who are not really landing the plane. So they're building all that amazing feeling of like belief and values and hope for the world, and then it doesn't really land into anything practical. And we really have to do a better job, I think, of getting both of those things to happen. There are very few people that when you connect them to their deeply held purpose, they say the action they want to take is buying a new Lamborghini. It's always more than that. It's always about other people. And I would love to see more coaching tools around how that is really purposefully brought to life. So I think that the shift from I to we is probably where coaching needs to look and go. That might be challenging because there's a lot of money in I and there's less money in we.
And I think I heard as well as something of the paradigm shift of actioning the intrinsic and exploring the purpose and values, and then developing and growing the skills to form actions from those. I think I heard something of the systemic in there as well, that the role of the coach is not to work just with the client, but to bring in that awareness of team, organization, society, planetary level.
Yeah. And another way of looking at that is to flip it on its head and look at the damage or the benefit to the individual of doing that. Because I think coaches often sometimes feel like, well, is it my place to say, well, what will your wife think about that? Or what will your kids think about you doing that? But actually, I mean, as I trained as a systems coach, and also I trained originally as a coactive coach, where we were trained to look at the whole person, not just the work that they did. So we look at the whole person, right? So then we need to think about the impact of all these other relationships on the whole person. And so if you're coaching a director of an organization and she says, I really love working really long hours, but my husband's sick to the death of it because I'm always late for dinner, then it feels like, well, where do I, how do I stand here? How do I help this person? They're saying they love working long hours, but other people don't love it so much. Whose side do I take? Where do I go? And actually, they're not living their best life because there's conflict at home. So there are convicting priorities here for sure, but we would almost always help that person come to a compromise position that doesn't feel like a huge compromise, that allows them to get that buzz from work while still having healthy relationships. Because if that husband asks for a divorce, that's going to be a problem, right? So actually, this isn't an ideal situation. It isn't okay to say, well, he doesn't really exist in this scenario. She should just have the world she wants. We would do that when it's a husband and it's a work-life balance topic. We all coach that stuff all the time. But we're not doing that when it's the climate, even in a local community context, around having a coal fire or driving a petrol car or all these things that loads of us do. We're not having that conversation, even on the impact of your coal fire on your city and therefore the air pollution your children are breathing. We sort of feel like that's not okay. But that's damaging our individual client as much as it's damaging the wider world in which they inhabit. And similarly, the other relationships that they're having they are stakeholders in the coaching. They're sitting in the room with us. And some of that we've made okay and some of it we haven't. Somebody once said something brilliant that I've never forgotten. A guy came to one of our community calls and he said, he had this sort of light bulb moment. He said, wow, if I was doing a strategy session with a board and the board were talking about everything that could happen to the business and they didn't mention diversity and inclusion, at some point I'd say, hey guys, you haven't mentioned diversity and inclusion. Do you need to cover that off somehow? Do you need to have a conversation? Do you need to look at the company through that lens? And he said, I'd have no problem saying that, but I would have a massive problem asking them about the environment. And I've only just realized that they're the same thing. And it is the same thing. It's just, 20 years ago, maybe we wouldn't have asked about diversity and inclusion either. We said, oh, that feels edgy. So we just need to change our perspective on it and normalize it.
And the thing that sparked for me, Charlie, is that one of the things that I've found a real challenge in my journey is the fact that in many ways, the climate crisis is a symptom of something wider. And it's, as you said, consumption, a whole way of being, economic systems. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about that and what we as coaches how far we can go with that conversation.
I think it is really the case that sometimes we're consuming because we love consuming. I'm going to out myself now as someone who loves IKEA. I feel so happy in IKEA. I don't know why. And I've met other people who do as well. I don't even need to buy anything. I love the environment of the place. I try and ration myself to a couple of trips a year, and I often don't really buy much more than a couple of candles. But that's an example, I think, of consumption that makes us feel good, right? But I think, unfortunately, all of us, me included, are often guilty of a different kind of consumption that is where we don't want to be with bad feelings. So we reach for something. It might be a glass of wine, or it might be a trip to buy a new dress or a new TV or a new whatever it is that somehow kills the time we would have had to have sat with that feeling and somehow smooths the surface again until the cracks appear next time. One of the things we say in our training is around, how we can be with dissonance, how we can be with these feelings and just let them come out and sort of fly free from us so that we don't do that unconscious consumption. And there's been like you said, the economic systems, we have been programmed, we even call it retail therapy, right? We've been programmed to do this. There's a great line in Don DeLillo's White Noise from I want to say 1990s, I guess he wrote that book, where there's a crisis in one family and a neighbor and the man who's had the crisis meet in the supermarket. And the neighbor says, I just heard the news. I came straight here. And you read it and you're like, yeah. And then you think, hang on a minute. What do you mean he came straight here? This is the supermarket. How did he know he'd meet him in the supermarket? And it's this sort of dystopia where our centres of community have become the shopping centre, have become the supermarket, have become a place you consume. And I just saw yesterday somebody saying, public libraries are one of the few places left where you can go and no one assumes you're going to spend any money. And there is so few places that we congregate now that allow us to just be in community, that we haven't downgraded. Your community centre might feel a bit, why would I want to go there? So I do think there's a bit of rewiring to be done around group, collective, community activities. And again, with COVID, I have some hope in a funny way, because I wonder if people working from home will revive communities that have become commuter belts. Will create, people wanting to go out for lunch in their local community, for example, meet people who they would normally not meet, just because they're no longer disappearing at 8 a.m. and coming back at 7 p.m. That's sort of what I hope.
It's a beautiful image. And that hope is something, in my experience around talking and coaching around the subject, the hope is for us as coaches, but also people we're talking to, something not to lose sight of, not to lose hold of.
And I think that what we need to be thinking about is the paradigm shift and how we model that as coaches, as people who happen to be coaches. So what is the paradigm we want to bring into being? And how are we aping the old one right now? So if we want a new paradigm in which there is for example, practical things like a 4-day week, or like where both husband and wife or both partners look after the children, not just the women, where people have time for community, time for volunteering. How much are we doing that ourselves? How much are we working all hours God sends, nose to the grindstone, which is a sort of ape of the current paradigm? Because if we want it to come into being, then it needs to be seen as a legitimate reality now.
And to link with your previous point there, for me, there's something, I think a barrier to people having conversations around climate, in my experience, is a fear of being criticised. Who are you? You're not holier than thou. I saw you eat a beef burger the other day and you drove here. So, and the sense that in order to have a conversation about it, that we need to be vegans that don't fly. And the experience myself has taught me that there's no perfect human that is living, but it's about doing the things consciously and mindfully and not mindlessly. So if you do own a car that isn't electric, to be conscious about when you're using it. And if you do want to have a chicken salad, to do so consciously and not mindlessly because there's adverts about it on the television or because everyone else is doing it.
Yeah.
That really helped me start having conversations about it without feeling a bit of imposter syndrome.
I think you're right. There's some huge bear traps here. And by saying, we can model things, I don't mean, perfection and this sort of, lives in the Shetlands raising their own, broad beans, kind of wearing a Hessian sack.
That does sound good.
The Shetlands are lovely, but, so, and I do also think that's a bit of a tactic of the media a little bit to focus on who people are rather than what they're trying to achieve. But I absolutely agree with you. I own a petrol car. We bought it before my daughter was born, thinking we were being really clever. It's fairly low emission, but it's still a petrol car. So we have a bike shed out in the front garden because we live in Oxford, so we do mostly cycle, and we put a green roof on it. And that green roof takes as much CO2 out of the atmosphere as every trip I make to the supermarket. Because I make one trip a week to the supermarket because I'm pretty old school and I don't do online delivery. So the green roof offsets it, if you like. That's what I'm told. But the next car we buy will be electric. And we've had quite a lot of conversations with the team about this. What can we and can't we do? What can we and can't we afford to do as families? What do we say our rules are as a company? We have made a decision not to fly anymore. And some good friends of ours are about to move to Boston and have their first baby. So we might well fly to Boston to see them and carbon offset it, which is not ideal. What I find is what we say in our theory of change at the Climate Change Coaches is that it's about resonance. So, and to be clear, I see grief as a form of love and as a place of resonance. So when people are feeling really resonant about something or, really good about it, they get into action and they stay in action. The action sticks because they feel good about it. It's like going on a diet when you're feeling really bad about yourself. That diet never lasts. Going running because you want to get rid of that tire around your middle rather than going running because you love running. It's a totally different feeling to that activity. So if we can do action that we really love, it sticks. So we keep doing it. Great. But what also happens is when we talk about it to other people, we sound really excited, we sound really happy, we sound really positive. We don't sound angsty, we don't sound like we've deprived ourselves, we don't sound sort of guilty and odd. We sound enrolling. And so we enroll other people, but also not only do we enroll them, we connect really easily with them. We don't blame them. We don't make them feel guilty because we don't feel it either. So it's not even in the conversation. And then all those people connecting really well change systems. They move like a shoal of fish. They become trend data. They become voter data, and they change systems. What we often see happening instead is that people get they do things because they feel they should. So they deprive themselves, if you like, and it feels that way. So it doesn't really stick, but it also doesn't sound very fun when they talk to other people about it. I talked to someone the other day who's a vegan, and for a long part of the conversation sounded really happy about it. And then she said, sometimes I sneak kids' cheese and I eat the kids' cheese. And I just thought, wow, that's just eat cheese if you like cheese. Yeah. Nobody's policing this. There's not a vegan police sort of checking up on you, but there was a feeling that it wasn't doing it right if she sort of, and I think that's a bit of a shame. I think we need to do what, within the bounds of our values feels right. I'll be honest, we still eat meat in our family, a fairly limited amount now, actually. We're pretty much vegetarian, but we made a really early decision, which was the only meat we ate, and this is a very privileged position, I appreciate, would be organic because it just naturally comes with higher welfare standards. And then we realized one day that while we walked around the supermarket and we're making these high-minded decisions in the supermarket, when we were at a petrol station on a long journey, we'd just buy a ham sandwich or buy a chicken sandwich with no thought. And almost certainly that was battery farmed. And the horror of that realization totally switched something on for us. We're like, right, that's it. From now on, all of that is vegetarian only, but also it cascaded into, and actually, do we need to eat meat this much at home? So pretty much, I would say almost every dinner now is meat-free, and I don't know, 90% of our lunches. And obviously breakfast, I should say, not stuffing bacon sandwiches for breakfast.
Well, I, on the subject of food, I feel like to our listeners, should say that there are some pretty decent vegan cheeses out there now, thankfully. As well. And it sounds like, if I'm pulling out a theme from what's being saying, it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like in order to win this, to succeed with this movement, it's about finding the positives and doing so optimistically and encouraging behavior change, not through guilt shaming, not through negative, not through forcing someone into deprivation, but to working with them and leveraging what they want. Yeah,
which is coaching by any other name, right? Which is kind of why we're in this game. So, I mean, I really think that's why coaches have such a big role to play, because it's already baked into the way that we behave with people. It's already there. And if you'd said to me 5 years ago, become a vegetarian or an almost vegetarian, I would have said, no way. No way, I don't have the bandwidth to work out how to make new dinners and new lunches. And I should also say my husband does most of the cooking. So even that would have been, just me pushing back and resisting. But now, having made the first few steps that did feel resonant to me, I've got there. Similarly, if you said to me about not flying, I would have said, I don't think that's possible. But now, we just make a decision and we stop doing it. And we've had some great trips across Europe by train, it turns out. So it has to be it's just like saying to somebody who's unhappy with their job, you should go in tomorrow and quit. You've got to do it at their pace. Now, that there will be people listening to this who will say, we don't have time for that. And on some level, they're right. We have to change really, really rapidly. And, well, two things. One is everyone doing imperfect change is better than a small group of people doing it absolutely perfectly. But the other most important thing is when we marginalize people and leave them out, we don't just leave people out. They come back and derail the process. They recruit other people to agree with them and they chip away at the process. And we've seen that in so many political issues. I think there's a danger that if we try and force people by blaming them and shaming them, we just polarize things even more. And actually, in actual fact, I don't believe anybody wakes up in the morning with the intention of screwing the planet. Even I'm going to sound really controversial now, even the CEO of Exxon thinks he's doing the right thing. So we've got to somehow connect the head to the heart, because in our hearts, I think we do have a sense that we want to have a livable planet for our kids, for ourselves. This is here now. We know this, but we are avoidant because it's in the too hard bucket. And again, doesn't that sound a bit like coaching? The people who say, life's great, my marriage is dreadful, but everything else is good. Or everything's great, but I really hate my job and I've hated it for a decade. We put off this big stuff, and coaches can help us sit face to face with it, but only if we're not blaming and judging and suggesting. So I really think that's why we have a role to play. And, in the climate change coaches, what we want to do is democratize those skills. So we're training people in coaching skills that help them influence and empower other people. Because there are some amazing people working in this space, truly amazing people who make you want to cry. They're so committed, and they're not getting the traction they deserve because they're using cognitive tactics, if for want of a better phrase. And actually, if they could use coaching skills, they'd be able to connect people to the issue, but they'd also listen to what's really in the resistance and be able to overcome it. And you and I know as coaches, that's actually not that hard, but it just takes a bit of training, So that's why our focus moved from being coaches to people to being trainers, to put the skills in their hands so that they could ripple those out to far, far more people. And we still do coach people in groups, but we're doing that to help them in a safe place find their place on the pitch. And the one thing I'd also just like to add about that is that there is a really important piece here about connection. Your cohort said this in our training program, and multiple people say this, that, the training was nice. And we'd like to believe the training was the most important thing. But actually, what was really important as well was being with other people who cared. And if you're a listener of this, sitting out there feeling really alone, step one is find people who care the way that you do, because they will keep you on the pitch on the days when it's hard. And so for me, that was my friend Jill, who did the MBA, who, when it gets tough, I'm in a mastermind group with her, and she will understand and keep me on the straight and narrow. And I hope that, your cohort still gets to meet from our training. Feeling alone is a really big enemy for people disconnecting, I think.
Yeah, I can really resonate and relate to that in both senses. The times when I've been on my own in a dark room learning about these topics and feeling awful, versus the times when I've been talking it through with a really supportive group of people that share the same beliefs and passions and hope, and give you some of that energy to keep you going. It's a shared topic.
And that's part of, you asked me earlier, like, how do you help people believe in the system? Well, that's a piece of it. Because, time and again, because our trainings are on Zoom, they're international, time and again, people say, I thought it was only me that cared, or I thought it was only my country that cared, or I thought it was only my continent, I thought it was just my kind of coach. And then I sat in this room, and there's all these people from so many different walks of life who all are really worried about this and all want to do something about this. And that starts to help you believe that humankind believes and cares and wants to do something, which is why these global movements are so useful, connecting into things like the Climate Reality Project or, the Climate Action Network, all these kind of places that bring people together. I worked with a client who, in one-to-one coaching, who was in deep grief about climate change, and came to a session one day and said, I just read the beginning of Active Hope by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston. And she said, early in the book, Joanna Macy says, there are 2.5 million organizations working on the environment in the world. And that must have been very old data. There's presumably, far, far more than that now. And she said, I saw that and I instantly felt calmer, because I thought, in some irrational way, it's all on me. And she knew it was irrational, but it was, of course, very potent. And so just helping de-escalate that feeling of it's only me that cares, which is very easy when you stand in a shopping centre or sit on a beach or, go to an airport to pick up a loved one. It's very easy to think nobody here cares except me. But I mean, our experience is everybody cares at some level. They just don't know what to do with that feeling. And coaching can help them work out what to do with that feeling.
And that's a beautiful sentiment with which to bring us to a close. One thing I'd love to check in on is, for our listeners, how best can they connect with you and follow the work that you and the climate change coaches are doing?
So there's several ways. One is to simply sign up on our website and get our newsletter. We're not one of those organisations that bombards people with news. You'll get a newsletter a handful of times a year, and hopefully it will be an amalgamation of interesting articles from around the web rather than us telling you about our stuff all the time. We also are invited to speak at lots of things, so look out for that. Additionally, we have a community call a couple of times a year, every couple of months typically, where we bring together anybody that's interested in using a coaching approach to climate. And so that might be coaches or it might be sustainability people. And that's always a really great way to meet other people who are interested. And then we have our coach training program that runs twice a year. The next one starts late September and runs until Christmas, which is ICF accredited. So there's several different ways, but we'd always say just get in touch. People get in touch all the time. We have really fascinating conversations. One of the nicest things is that people who do our training often end up becoming collaborators. So 2 people who we're having conversations with at the moment met on our training. One's in California, one's in Canada. They've started a business together working with organizations. And now we're having these fantastic conversations about how, we could do something together, which is just really, really cool. So do get in touch with us. We love just hearing from people and hearing people's enthusiasm. It keeps us going, apart from anything else. It helps us believe that everyone cares and that we can do something. And next year, our book comes out. We're writing a book about how to use a coaching approach to galvanize climate action. And with any luck, as they say in Sierra Leone, by God in power, by God's grace, it will be out next summer. and then that will be another way to hear more about it.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much for today, and thank you so much more broadly for all the work that you've done. As I said, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to you for helping me with my own journey around the climate crisis. So full of appreciation for the work that you're doing.
Thanks, George. It was a real pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you all for joining us today, to our listeners, and stay tuned for the next episode in our Coaching in the Climate Crisis series. This podcast was brought to you by the Association for Coaching. Discover more business coaching resources, thought leadership, and online learning at associationforcoaching.com.